I've got to take you all in. I want to begin by expressing my deep gratitude to Dean Gregory Sterling and to the entire faculty of Yale Divinity School for the invitation to give these lectures. You have genuinely honored me, and I am grateful. Never did I dream, as a little girl growing up in the 50s in East Tennessee, going to preaching missions with my preacher dad and listening to him preach his own impassioned sermons, that I would ever preach at all, much less give the Lyman Beecher lectures. I have often said that if I ever wrote the history of my life, I would call it God's Other Name is Surprise. You have both surprised and wowed me with this one. Thank you. I also have to tell you that when I first received the invitation to give these lectures about a year and a half ago, just as I was settling into my retirement life with my husband Alfred in Durham, North Carolina, my second thought was, well, so much for retirement. And then I thought, well, what can I tackle? What topic can I tackle that will make me excited to be working on these lectures as opposed to, say, playing more with my 2-year-old grandson, Langston? As I reflected on that question, I found myself asking another: what has changed the most about preaching in my lifetime? That might be an interesting and worthy topic for these lectures, and one that the many Beecher lectures before me have not already exhausted. I didn't have to think long at all to realize that both the topic I wanted to address and what had changed the most were one and the same. And they have to do with the rapidly growing number of women in the pulpit and in the field of homiletical scholarship in the U.S., and the difference those women have made in how we think about and experience preaching today. So later, when I learned that this year Yale University was celebrating the 150th year of the first woman in the graduate school and the 50th year of matriculation of women to Yale College, I, a lifelong Presbyterian, decided that these particular Beecher lectures were foreordained. On a more personal note, this year marks the 40th year of my own graduation from seminary and ordination to ministry in the Presbyterian Church, USA. I grew up in what my husband has affectionately called the tribe of Levites in the Presbyterian Church, with a father who's a minister, an uncle who's a minister, my maternal grandfather's a minister, assorted other Christian educator and missionary types in the family as well. I grew up going to church Sunday morning, church Sunday evening, prayer meeting Wednesday night. We even did church for vacation. My family every year went to the Presbyterian Conference Center in Montreat, North Carolina, where I heard a host of wonderful preachers through the years, including many outstanding African-American male preachers. But I never actually heard a woman preach, and heard it called preaching, until I entered seminary in 1975 at age 24. While I was not among the first wave of women to go to Union Presbyterian Seminary in Virginia, I was among the second or third wave, and I recall in the early years of my ministry how my denomination published a little book of what we jokingly called baseball cards that had the name and the picture of every ordained clergywoman in our denomination on them. There weren't that many, less than 100 as I recall, but the idea was that we would study these little cards and get to know each other by name. About a decade after my ordination, when I was completing my PhD in preaching at Princeton Theological Seminary and first began attending the Academy of Homiletics, the North American Professional Society for Teachers and Scholars in the field of preaching, the women scholars who were in attendance at that meeting, all 6 to 8 of us, could sit around one table easily for breakfast. The year was 1988, and we were very much a minority in a field that had long been dominated by men. Because of my own life experiences and the challenges I have faced becoming a preaching woman, I have long had a passion for encouraging other women in their own preaching ministries. When I embarked on my first full-time teaching position at Union Theological Seminary in Virginia, church historian Rebecca Weaver and I taught the first course ever offered at that seminary that had feminist in the title. We really thought the walls were going to fall in. Later, we, along with another colleague across the street, Linda McKinnish Bridges, at the Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond, she later became the president there, we sponsored a conference for women seminarians on our campuses. And I remember writing to Yale theologian Letty Russell and asking her if she would please come be our keynote speaker. I think I wrote something like this: "Please, will you come over to Macedonia and help us?" God bless her, she came. In the early 1990s, I joined the faculty of Princeton Theological Seminary, and then it was then that I began offering a course specifically designed to encourage women in their preaching ministries. I called it Women's Ways of Preaching, and I continued to teach a variety of that course for the next 25 years, both at Princeton Seminary and then here at Yale Divinity School. One of my major goals for that course was to encourage women in their ministries and to provide a supportive environment in which they could begin to address some of the issues they were going to face as women in ministry. I want you to know that here with me this week are a group of 5 women who were in that very first Women's Ways of Preaching class at Princeton in 1995. These women bonded there. They have all had wonderful careers in ministry ever since, and they have gotten together every single year since that for a week of continuing education and mutual support. They have come from all over the East Coast of the United States, from Florida to Cape Cod, to be here. And I want to ask them to stand up right now so that you can see who they are. I might add parenthetically that one of that group now has her own PhD in preaching and a book coming out soon. Yes, Donna Giver-Johnson. I have witnessed an amazing number of changes in my lifetime surrounding women in the pulpit and the academy, and I know that many of you have as well. So what I want to do in my lectures this week is reflect on the nature of those changes and how they have affected how we experience preaching. Today, I'm going to embark on a 60-year retrospective of what has happened to women preachers in the U.S. context. I'm going to begin by sharing some statistics about the rapid growth of women preaching, also noting where that growth has not happened. Then I want to put some flesh on those statistics by sharing the stories of some of the women who I refer to as the foremothers, the foremothers of my own professional society, the Academy of Homiletics. I want you to hear their voices, telling in their words the stories of their lives as trailblazers in this field. One of the major pieces of research I undertook for these lectures was to conduct interviews with 16 of those foremothers. Those interviews will eventually become a part of the permanent archives of the Academy of Homiletics housed at Vanderbilt University. I have to say that interviewing these women in my field was one of the most inspiring and moving things I've done in a long time. The idea to do this did not originate with me. It originated with my buddy, Tom Troger, always my best creative ideas person. When I found out I was going to be giving these lectures, I wrote to Tom and Merle and I said, please, can we come see you and can I have a whole morning to just brainstorm with Tom about these lectures? Thank you, Tom and Merle, for welcoming us into your home and for making that possible. But at one point, I remember that Saturday morning, Tom looked at me, you know what you need to do, Nora? I said, no, what do I need to do, Tom? He said, you need to interview the foremothers of our academy. I said, yes, I do. So I did. And their comments will be interwoven throughout all three of these lectures. Tomorrow in Lecture 2, I want to reflect on some of the major contributions of women scholars have made in the field of preaching, namely the recovery of the histories, or as I prefer to call them, the herstories, of women of previous generations whose names were largely unknown to us until 20, 30 years ago. When I attended seminary in the mid-'70s, it was really easy for me to believe. I actually thought that the first women had only been ordained 20 or 30 years before, and that those were when women started preaching. But thanks to a number of women scholars and women homileticians in church history, in preaching and in church history, we know better. Women have been blazing trails in the preaching of the word for centuries. And often they have paid a very high price for doing so. So tomorrow we're going to reflect on their calls to preach and the creative ways they found to exercise them. And finally, in Lecture 3, I'm going to take a look at how the presence of contemporary preaching women and men, their sermons, their books, their teaching, their witness, has literally transformed our current understandings of what preaching is and what it does. My hope through these lectures is to honor the many amazing preaching women who have come before us, to celebrate their gifts, their dedication, their perseverance, their hard work. But as I do so, I also want to acknowledge the deep pain and anguish that some of these women, along with other marginalized people in the church, such as those in the LGBTQIA community, have suffered when their own God-given callings have been denied, suppressed, or silenced. That, too, is an important part of this story. So, with that preamble, let's dive in. Women Preachers in the U.S., a 60-year retrospective. 25 years ago, Barbara Brown Zickman, who was then president of Hartford Theological Seminary, and two of her colleagues undertook what was at the time the most extensive survey of clergy women from predominantly white Protestant denominations ever undertaken. Their research, published in the book Clergy Women, An Uphill Calling, summarized the findings from nearly 5,000 surveys provided by ordained women and men in 15 Protestant denominations, including all the major mainline traditions, as well as Southern Baptist, Unitarian Universalist, and Assemblies of God traditions. These researchers did not include historically black Protestant denominations in their study, since they were at the time being surveyed in another study undertaken by Dolores Carpenter of Howard University, about which I will say more shortly. The aims of the research of this team were several-fold: to compare statistically the numbers of clergy women in the mid-1990s with numbers from the mid-1970s, to explore the ways in which denominational procedures and practices influence the experiences of clergy women within them, and to assess how successfully denominations and congregations were handling the rising numbers of clergy women. At the time of their survey, Zickman and her team found that United Methodist reported the largest number of ordained women overall, about 3,000, followed by the United Church of Christ, around 1,800, and the Assemblies of God, around 1,600. However, when they looked at the percentages of clergy women within the various denominations, they found that the Unitarian Universalists had the highest percentage, 30%. The United Church of Christ, the second highest, 25%, followed by the Disciples of Christ, which had 18%. The Southern Baptist Convention, which had formally adopted resolutions against the ordination of women, and the Free Methodist Church had the smallest percentages, less than 1%. Their study did not include Roman Catholic or Orthodox denominations who were not ordaining women at all. Their study also showed that clergy women were significantly underpaid relative to men, earning 9% less than their male counterparts in similar jobs, that women had more difficulty finding jobs than their male counterparts, in part because denominational leadership deployment procedures consistently placed women at a disadvantage. Clergy women, they wrote, are unwittingly tracked on to positions with less occupational status and promise. They also found that women were far more likely than men to become part-time pastors, to opt for employment in specialized ministries, or to leave parish ministry altogether. These researchers subtitled their book An Uphill Calling, because they predicted that women would continue to battle practices and prejudices on the parts of their denominations and congregations that would make the way forward a difficult one for them. Just a few years later, Dolores Carpenter of Howard University published her study of clergy women from historically Black Protestant denominations. Her findings were recorded in her book, A Time for Honor. If Zickman's study showed that white women faced an uphill climb, Carpenter's study showed that African American clergy women were trying to scale mountain faces. The pay gap between clergymen and clergy women was 15% in the higher ranges. Clergy women's acceptance in historic Black denominations was problematic, often with female congregants and male senior pastors being the most non-accepting. And their opportunities for serving as pastors of churches or for pastoral advancement were slim, given that congregations preferred younger male clergy to their senior pastors. Only 1/5 of the ordained clergy women actually found employment as full-time pastors versus half of the men. Given the reality that half of these women were single, 2/3 of them being single mothers with young children, the challenges they faced providing for themselves and their families were enormous. The majority said they had acquired their primary salaries from secular jobs and worked either for free or for little pay in the church. These clergy women also entered seminary later in life than their male counterparts, the median age of admission being age 40. 45% said they had switched denominations, with over half of those saying that the reason for doing so was because they wanted to be ordained. These statistics give testimony to the ways in which women's experiences of call are complicated by gender formation and delayed awareness of their own gifts and abilities. When women grow up in an environment that discourages them for recognizing their God-given gifts and callings, or which openly forbids them to pursue them, it takes tremendous courage, perseverance, and time for them to pursue that calling. When you add to the emotional and psychological pressures women endure, the grim realities of trying to provide for families when jobs are scarce, salaries are poor, and positive support from parishioners is lacking, it is a wonder these women pursued their callings at all. The latest study of clergy women was undertaken just last year by Eileen Campbell Reed, a Baptist clergy woman who describes herself as an academic entrepreneur. When she realized that no major studies had been made of clergy women in the past 2 decades, she and her research assistant set out to rectify that by conducting their own study in conversation with denominational leaders. She's published some of her most significant findings in an online article while she works on a major book. Here are a few of her major findings. In 1960, the U.S. Census reported women represented 2.3% of all U.S. clergy. In 2016 report, women represented 20.7% of all professional clergy. In a number of the mainline denominations, the percentage of women clergy has doubled or tripled since 1994. For example, numbers have tripled in the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and the Assemblies of God. Numbers of clergy women in the United Methodist, Disciples of Christ, and Church of the Brethren have doubled, while Presbyterians grew from 19 to 29%. American Baptist numbers have remained relatively unchanged the past 20 years, with only 13% of clergy being women. On the other end of the spectrum, Unitarian Universalists and United Church of Christ clergywomen have actually reached numerical equity with clergymen. In addition, their research showed that numbers were also growing in other Protestant, Pentecostal, and peace churches. Women currently represent 30% of Mennonite clergy, 25% of Church of God clergy, and 37% of Foursquare clergy, the Foursquare denomination having been founded by a woman, Amy Semple McPherson. The statistics for Southern Baptist women are harder to track, since that denomination still denies ordination to women. However, the Progressive Alliance of Baptists that broke off from the Southern Baptist Convention in 1987 has women pastoring 40% of its congregation. I should say it's a small denomination with only 143 congregations, but still kudos to them. And 7% of congregations in the more moderate Cooperative Baptist Fellowship are pastored by women. Notably, however, this study claims that none of the 47,000 Southern Baptist congregations in the U.S. have female pastors. While the Roman Catholic Church still denies women ordination to the offices of priest and deacon, this study notes that since 2015, lay ministers outnumber priests as designated leaders in parish ministry in the United States, and 80% of those ecclesial ministers are women. Times are a-changin'. Campbell Reed also notes that in historically black denominations, women continue to push up a very steep hill to follow God's call into professional ministry. For example, in Black Baptist churches, women represent 50 to 75% of church members, but less than 10% of church leaders and perhaps 1% of pastors. The African Methodist Episcopal Church offers more hopeful statistics in that its 2017 annual report on women in ministry identified 3,200 women being ordained for pastoral office and around 1,200 of them serving appointments as pastors. Since 2000, the AME has also elected 4 women as bishops. Campbell Reed also observed that during the past 20 years, one of the biggest changes has been the increasing acceptance of LGBTQ folk as ordained ministers, and even in some cases as bishops. However, she says that in many places, quote, they continue to struggle uphill in their vocations to serve churches that remain ambivalent or outright hostile to them. Finally, a book on women's ordination in America published in 2018 by 2 political scientists. I'm really intrigued by this book. Benjamin Knoll and Cammie Jo Boland cite several additional statistics worthy of consideration. A 2015 National Congregation Survey showed that while 3 out of 5 congregations in the U.S., that's like 60% of the U.S. congregations, allow women to serve as the head clergy person, only 11% of the congregations actually have a woman as the solo or senior clergy person, 11%. While Zickman and Williams found in the 90s that clergy women made between 9 and 15% less than clergymen, a 2016 survey found that clergy women now make, on average, only 76 cents for every dollar that the male clergy make. It seems that the pay gap is increasing, not decreasing. When taken together, these statistics tell a mixed tale. In some denominations, the numbers of women are growing and reaching numerical parity, while in others, they're not growing much at all or have stalled. Furthermore, while the numbers are growing overall, it is still the case that women are senior or solo leaders in only 11% of U.S. congregations. And in the 2 largest church bodies, the Southern Baptist Convention and the Roman Catholic Church, it is still not possible for women to be ordained to ministry at all. Clergy women are still being underpaid. They're still having difficulty getting calls as senior pastors in larger parishes, and they tend to spend longer periods of time in rural parishes or as assistant pastors than they do as solo or senior pastors. Now, those are what the statistics tell us. What do the women themselves tell us? As I indicated, my interview sample here was relatively narrow, 16 women who not only have been preachers themselves, but many of them have taught preaching, so I don't claim they speak for the whole, but their responses to the questions I asked them do help flesh out and amplify some of the statistics I've cited here, as well as those life experiences that go on behind the scenes. The very first question I asked all of the women I interviewed was, when was the first time you heard a woman preach, and what was the effect of that experience on you? For nearly all the white Protestant women I interviewed, the answer to the first question was very much akin to my own experience. These women didn't hear a woman preach until they were in young adulthood. And sometimes they couldn't even remember the first woman they heard preach. They just knew they'd heard men in their entire growing up experience in the church. In terms of the effect this experience had on them, Carol Norin, who is ordained in the United Methodist Church and teaches at North Park Seminary, recounts that she was 24 years old doing a seminary intern year in Manchester, England, when she heard Sister Mabel Sykes, a Methodist deaconess, lead the Sunday evening service at one of the two churches she was serving. Norin says, "As she preached, I had the sensation of someone holding up a mirror. That is, oh, this is what it looks and sounds like when a woman preaches. I wonder if that's what I sound like." She adds, "Honestly, I hadn't given much thought to gender in preaching before that moment." Lucy Lind Hogan, professor preaching at Wesley Theological Seminary in D.C. and an ordained Episcopal priest, recalls that when she entered seminary in 1976, at the Church Divinity School of the Pacific in Berkeley, women were not allowed to be ordained priests. They were allowed to be ordained deacons, she said, but thus far none had been. And I thought to myself, why am I doing this? I don't even know why I'm doing this. The first women she heard preach were her two seminary classmates in the preaching course with her. She says there were actually 4 students in the class, 3 women, 1 man, and the professor, who was a church musician. We basically just wrote a sermon every week and preached it to each other, so basically 2 women and I taught ourselves to preach. Mary Donovan Turner, who has taught preaching for 31 years at Pacific School of Religion, says she has no memories of the first time she heard a woman preach and surmises it must have been while she was in seminary. All of her pastors growing up in the Disciples of Christ Church in Louisiana were men, and she says that even when she visited that church about 10 years ago, it still had an all-male pastoral staff and an all-male group of elders and deacons marching down the aisle 2 by 2 to serve communion. But Turner has very positive memories of church and being drawn toward its mysteries. Even as a 5-year-old, she said, I was enthralled with the mystery of it. There was in the front of the Disciples' Church this baptistry because we were immersed. And then there were these glass panels on either side of the baptistry. It is a phenomenally beautiful brick church in and out. I still dream about it. So on Sunday mornings, the big organ would start playing and the minister would come through one of those glass panels that doesn't really look like a door. And in my child's mind, there are all these passageways back there. It's mysterious and dark and close to God. YDS alumna and ordained Lutheran pastor Barbara Lundblad, who is with us today, now retired from teaching preaching at Union Theological Seminary in New York, doesn't remember the first time she heard a woman preach either. But she does recall the first time she saw a woman preside at the Eucharist. It was right here in Marquand Chapel in 1976. When Barbara was a first-year seminary student who was then 32 years old. Joan Forsberg, who had been ordained by the United Church of Christ in 1954 and who went on to serve as registrar and dean of students at YDS, mentoring many women along the way, was the presider at that table. She was such an amazing presence, says Barbara. What I think I most remember is her presence and the way she reached out to this whole community of people. We were all gathered around the communion table here, and as she did that, she said, people will come from north and south and east and west, and she turned around, and I felt like this is the first time I have been invited to communion in my life. Jana Childers, an ordained Presbyterian minister and professor at San Francisco Theological Seminary, recalls growing up as a child in a conservative Pentecostal church and surviving church by regularly critiquing the sermons she experienced as being in a manipulative style. Her first experience hearing a woman preach came just before she went to seminary. She had red hair, said Childers, who, if you know her, has beautiful red hair herself. I was just so struck with the light falling on that hair and that face and the fact that I was watching a woman preach. It's one of those mental snapshots you carry with you the rest of your life. She was lively and she was very sharp. Her points were very focused. I remember thinking, I don't think I'm that focused, but I sure do like the whole idea of what she's doing. Christine Smith, author of the first book that addressed preaching from a feminist perspective, recalls that she was in college and on vacation in Nags Head, North Carolina with her family when she heard that a woman who ran a beach ministry there was going to be preaching on Sunday morning. Chris herself says that she had had a strong sense of call to ordained ministry since high school, but had never before seen a woman do what she wanted to do. So she announced to her family that she was going to hear this woman preach. What was it like for her? I think I was really overcome with joy, she said, and with sorrow that I was in college and I had never before heard a woman preach. For United Methodist Alice McKenzie, former Beecher lecturer who teaches at Perkins School of Theology at SMU, the first time she heard a woman preach was after she was ordained and was attending a workshop led by our own Barbara Brown Taylor. I was in awe, she said, and I thought, why aren't there more role models around? Where are they? Thank God I have had this experience. The Roman Catholic women I interviewed, both of whom are women religious, had a somewhat different experience than their Protestant counterparts regarding women in preaching. Sister Joan Delaplane, who was the very first woman to join the Academy of Homiletics in 1977, and who celebrates this year 70 years as a sister of the Dominican Order of Preachers, recounts, "It's a good question when I heard the first woman preach, and it's a hard one for me, because growing up Catholic and having Catholic sisters, they really preached, I would say, in a different kind of way. Then I entered a community of all women who just ordinarily would speak. They were really preaching, we just didn't call it that. I think I was never taken aback or stunned or in awe when I'd hear women preaching, because that's just part of my life, but in a different kind of way. Not necessarily from the pulpit, as it were." Mary Catherine Hilkert, professor of systematic theology at Notre Dame and a former Beecher lecturer, is also a Dominican sister who recalls hearing the Dominican sisters preaching through the years. One of the most notable was Kathleen Cannon, now her colleague at Notre Dame, who led a week-long retreat for Hilkert's congregation in Akron, Ohio, when Hilkert was serving as a school teacher. It was a wonderful collaboration between herself and Paul Phillipsburg, the Dominican friar she was preaching with, that gave me such a sense of the scriptures and how she lives them, how she loves them. Hilkert also recalled hearing a prioress in her community who had spent much of her life in El Salvador and who had known Oscar Romero, preaching powerfully and joyfully out of a strong sense of social justice. Several of the women of color interviewed also recalled women preaching, but not ordained women and not from the pulpit. Minerva Carcaño, the first Latina bishop in the United Methodist Church, says that though she didn't hear women officially preaching until she was in preaching class in seminary, she had known 3 women, lay women, who were local pastors and gave tremendous witness to their faith around the edges. She also recalls how her grandmother Sophia and her mother Rebecca would preach to her at table and unpack scripture for her. When she first heard her women classmates preach in seminary, Carcaño says, "I felt this great resonance with these women. I felt their spirit. I felt the possibility of preaching in my own voice." I found in the brothers of the class very much the model of traditional preaching, and I thought, I'm not a man. That doesn't feel comfortable. It didn't feel like it was a skin I could put on. Teresa Fry Brown, Bandy Professor of Preaching at Candler School of Theology and the first African-American woman tenured on that faculty, says that in her black church upbringing, although she didn't hear women doing what was preaching, there were women in her culture who were called prayer warriors and who would lead testimony services. They were doing the same thing that the men were doing, but they were speakers. So I heard speakers from the time I was aware I was in church. She says her own Aunt Thelma, her grandmother's sister, it turned out, was a pastor of a church 35 miles from where she grew up, but that the family never spoke of it and actually kept it a secret from her. She would hear Aunt Thelma speaking at local churches, but she reports that Thelma was never allowed to do so in the pulpit. She always had to do so from the floor. Martha Simmons is one of those African-American clergy women Dolores Carpenter talks about who left her Black Baptist tradition in hopes of finding ministry opportunities in the United Church of Christ. Simmons, the creator and director of the African-American lectionary, recalls that in her childhood she never heard women preach from the pulpit, but she did hear women musicians sneak-a-preach. Sneak-a-preach. Love that term. Simmons says this was a common practice in African-American church history. Women who couldn't use the title reverend in certain circles, Simmons recounts, but who were very well liked in those circles, they didn't upset the apple cart. They'd sneak-a-preach while they were singing. The most currently well-known preacher to do that, she says, is Shirley Caesar. I guess Shirley Caesar had been out there singing and sneaking preaching for 30, 40 years before she took the title reverend. And every time she sang, she would do it. Jennifer Benjamin Brooks, professor of preaching at Garrett Evangelical Seminary, grew up in Trinidad in the Caribbean. She recounts that the one place she heard women preaching, though they wouldn't have considered themselves doing so, was in the Evangelical Spiritual Baptist Shouters Church. These women would preach on street corners, but not church sanctuaries. It seemed to me that what they preached was always very well connected to life. I remember one woman coming down the street where we lived and standing at the corner and preaching about the world, the state of the world. And she saw babes with mothers in their arms. You heard what I said? Not mothers with babes in their arms. That image has never left me. For Rabbi Margaret Moores Winnig, who teaches preaching and liturgics at Hebrew Union College in New York City, the path to preaching was somewhat different than that of her Christian homiletical colleagues. Maggie did not grow up in a religious household, but converted to Judaism while in high school. She'd grown up with a mother and a sister who were pioneering feminists in their respective fields, so she just assumed women could do anything they wanted, including becoming rabbis. It had not occurred to her otherwise, she said. At the time she entered rabbinical school in 1978, however, there were only 3 women who had been ordained rabbis in the Reform movement, and 1 who had been ordained in the Reconstructionist movement. The woman who was most influential to Rabbi Winnig in her preaching formation was none other than Barbara Lundblad. The first congregation that Rabbi Winnig served, Beth Am Synagogue in Washington Heights in New York City, rented space from the Lutheran congregation where Barbara served as pastor. For all those years, she recounts, I not only heard Barbara preach, but for a number of those years, she used to live her Sunday sermon manuscript in the pulpit. And when I got to work on Monday, I would find it and read it. Between the feedback that I got on a weekly basis from my own congregation and Barbara's example, I began to learn a lot more about preaching than I had learned in rabbinical school. In my interviews with these women, I also asked them about the challenges they faced along the way. Alice McKenzie recounts that her obstacles were internal. She was shy and didn't want to go into a profession that required public speaking. Barbara Lundblad talked about having worked for a number of years as a youth minister in Minnesota and very much wanting to affirm the ministries of the laity. So she had an internal struggle about whether to become ordained or not. She didn't want to undercut lay ministry. She said it was a panel here at YDS that helped her make that decision to go on for ordination. Linda Clater, who taught preaching for many years at Church Divinity School of the Pacific, recounts that before she went to seminary, she was teaching classics at a university. She did that for 20 years. And that she had become the chair of the vestry in her church, the head of the vestry. She said the opposition she encountered was more to women's leadership than ordination per se. She got some pushback from the men on the vestry who didn't want a woman in charge. But once again, there was a bit of a divide between some of what the white women and women of color recounted regarding the intensity of opposition to their cause. Minerva Carcaño tells of the opposition she received both from her parents and her pastor when she indicated she wanted to go to seminary and become ordained. When her father expressed concerns about his daughter going to seminary to their pastor, the pastor told him, "Pablito, let her go. She will find a good man called by God, marry him, become a good wife to this pastor, and all of this will be left behind." A year or so later, when Carcaño was in seminary at Perkins School of Theology, the Board of Ordained Ministry from her conference in Texas came to meet with the 4 people who were seminarians from their conference, 3 men and Carcaño. She recounts that she was the last one to be interviewed, and that at the end of the interview, the people on that board turned to her pastor, who was sitting at the table with them since he was the registrar for ministry in the conference, and said, "Why didn't you tell us?" She realized in that moment that her pastor had not even put her name on the list of seminarians up for ordination. Carcaño tells that later, when she was ordained and appointed by the bishop to serve a small new church start of 30 people in Lubbock, Texas, that had been abandoned by their previous pastor, she arrived in January after a snowstorm. She said, "It was tremendously cold, and I'm trying to build a relationship with those who are present, and I felt the coldness of their welcome, with some exceptions. When I got up to preach, I noticed they were passing a book person to person to person. In some cases, I could see their finger pointing to a particular place in that book, and whatever they were being invited to read as I preached. I learned at the end of worship that it was a Bible, that they had opened it to that Pauline passage that said, 'Women shall not speak in the community of faith.' This was my first appointment. This was my first sermon as a pastor of a church in my own right. And that was the reception." And she added, "It was the same every Sunday for the time I was there." Martha Simmons, who was worshiping in a Black Baptist church in San Francisco at the time she proposed going to seminary, requires the people in her congregation, quote, "lost their minds when she said she wanted to be ordained and kept asking her, 'Why are you doing this? Are you sure you can't do something else?' Finally, she recounts, "The pastor gave me a date to preach my licensing sermon, and the whole city was abuzz. They printed it in the local newspaper and everything. The place was packed. And the pastor, at the very last minute, canceled it." This happened to Simmons several more times over the space of a number of months before she eventually did preach her sermon and was licensed. Teresa Fry Brown recalls having 6 people in her AME ordination class, 5 men and herself. Fry Brown, whose husband divorced her when she decided to go to seminary, was a single mother. She said she'd expected opposition from men, but that it was older women in her home church who really made her life difficult. Some of them accused her of going to seminary so she could have sex with the men. Others acted out their opposition in more visual ways. At that time, she recounts, we were worshiping in the education building, getting ready to build a new sanctuary. Whenever I was called to read a scripture or do a prayer, this group of women would literally stand up and turn their backs, turn the chairs around, and sit with their backs to me. Certainly, some of these women had very positive experiences in their first parish. Barbara Lundblad served hers for 16 years, thank God. But there were others who opted to go directly into PhD studies after seminary because they simply couldn't find a ministry job. Lucy Hogan recalls how difficult it was to find a job. She said clergy would just out and out lie to her that they didn't have jobs, and the next thing she knew, they'd hired one of her male classmates. She also recalls that after she was ordained a priest in 1982, the bishops of the Episcopal Church voted a conscience clause that allowed bishops in a diocese who opposed women's ordination not to ordain women. Shortly thereafter, Lucy's husband was stationed, who was a medical doctor in the Navy, was stationed in San Diego. And Lucy, as a newly ordained priest from Minnesota, recalls visiting a local Episcopal church on a Sunday when the rector was absent because he was attending the church's general convention. When he returned home, the rector called Lucy and said, "I understand you visited my church." She replied that she and her husband and her son had visited. And the rector then said, "I'd like to ask you not to do that again." He did not want an ordained woman worshiping in his church. Chris Smith's story is the story, I fear, of far too many gay and lesbian folk who have answered the call of God to go into Christian ministry, and it's all the more poignant because of its resonance with what's going on in the United Methodist Church today. As I've already indicated, Chris grew up in the heart of the United Methodist Church and felt a strong call to become a parish ministry since her high school days. And after graduating from seminary, that's what she did. She went and was a pastor of a church, and she loved it. But she says she lived in constant fear of being outed or losing either her church or her ordination or both. She pursued doctoral studies in preaching in order to chart a different career path for herself, but testifies to this day that her true calling was always to parish ministry. She left the United Methodist Church for the United Church of Christ, but also recounts standing in the midst of the seminary where she was teaching at the time she made her decision and weeping because she felt she had no choice but to do so. I share these stories with you because they give us just a glimpse into the reality of what contemporary clergy women have had to go through to exercise their callings in Christ's church, and women are still struggling. I know outstanding clergy women who, at midlife, find it almost impossible to find a job commensurate with their skills and their abilities because of the preference for younger male clergy in the church. I know younger clergy women who find that their denominations will ordain them but then give them no help in finding parish-based jobs. And of course, there are still far too many LGBTQIA clergy who live in constant fear of losing their jobs or their ordinations, or who are finding it impossible to be ordained at all in churches they dearly love. Furthermore, there are seminary students, including students here at Yale Divinity School, who struggle to make their way in the church. I think of that Pentecostal student I taught who finally got her church body in Texas to ordain her, but never could find a parish to serve within her denomination, so ended up switching denominations and going through the entire ordination process all over again in the United Church of Christ. I think of that Roman Catholic Latina student I taught years ago who had a fire in her bones to preach, and finally announced to our class one day that she had begun preaching online because God had called her and nobody was going to stop her from exercising her gifts. And I think of a Korean American woman in my very last Women's Ways of Preaching class here at Yale who also had a fire in her belly for preaching and who was quite a gifted preacher, but who seemed to find opposition to her voice and leadership at nearly every turn. Yes, we've come a long way during the past 60 years, and I rejoice and celebrate that reality, but we still have a ways to go, dear friends. As Lucy Hogan reminded me, it's still the case that over half the church women in the world can't be ordained. And a part of what we need to do is become the best advocates we can for opening the pulpits to all women. I was struck when I interviewed these 16 foremothers at how many pointed to clergymen who had mentored them in the early years of their ministry, had opened their pulpits to them, had encouraged them to become all they were created to be. I was also struck by how important to these women was the support and encouragement of women, lay and clergy, who would advocate for them and refuse to quit pressing the church to fully embrace them in their callings. We've come a long way, but before we rest on our laurels, we also need to take a look at the history that predates these past 60 years, a story of preaching women who embraced their calls long before denominations even thought about ordaining them, and ask, what was it that empowered them and gave them courage to persevere in their callings when church and society so strongly opposed them? That history, or rather that her story, is the topic for tomorrow's lecture. Thank you.